I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and resplendent in royal yellow behind me is the new MG5. There has been so much interest in the MG5 on the Chasing Cars platform over the last few weeks, so I thought I gotta get myself one of those and review it for you guys today, and that's exactly what I'm gonna be doing. Now, most of the reviews out there already of the MG5 focus on the more expensive version, the turbo version. I've avoided that one. I've actually brought along the very cheapest, most affordable MG5 because this is one of Australia's most affordable cars, and yet it is a big sedan. Okay, it doesn't have a turbo engine, but it's $24,990 drive away, and in late 2023, that price is just astonishing. So, is the MG5 like the MG4, an MG model which has been very highly rated by us here on Chasing Cars? Or is it more like the MG ZS and HS, which are cars that we've found far below average? I'm going to tell you the answer to that question in today's video, and we'll see whether MG is doing a U-turn from below average driving dynamics. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Jumping into the MG5 now, we find most of the areas where MG has cut costs in order to achieve this car's stunning 25 grand drive-away price. Spoiler alert, it actually isn't that bad to drive, and we'll get there in a moment, but you are going to notice areas in the interior which are less comfortable than what you might find in rivals like a base model Kia Cerato, Hyundai i30 sedan, Toyota Corolla sedan, or Mazda 3 sedan, with the big caveat that all of those vehicles cost thousands more than this car. The Kia is the closest in price, but even a base model Cerato is going to be about another $2,500 drive away over this car. So what am I talking about? Well, first of all, we're sitting on vinyl seat trim here. This is something MG decided not to do in the MG4, which has cloth seats, far better for the Australian summer. It is the first really hot day of the late spring here in Sydney today, and it's hell in this car today because with the vinyl, your back just gets so sweaty. This fabric doesn't breathe. It would have been much better to be a cloth seat. Come on, car makers, just go back to cloth for hot countries like Australia, and it's getting hot everywhere around the world now, so this vinyl, it just ain't it. We get a plastic steering wheel. It's actually a nice shape and size and decent to hold with easy shortcut keys, which are physical, but of course being a plastic wheel, it doesn't feel like anything special. The tech though is actually not so bad. We've got a central touchscreen here inclined to the driver, toggle keys for your volume and also some climate controls here, which is really handy, and also a digital screen or partially digital in front of the driver, which gives you a bunch of trip computer readouts. What we don't have is wireless smartphone connectivity. You've got to plug your phone in with an old school USB port down here to see Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. We also don't have built-in navigation, and the stereo quality from the 4 speakers in the base model is pretty woeful, if I'm telling the truth. Also, material quality is very cheap above the belt line. Again, this is a cheap car. You've got to cut corners in order to make it cheap. Oddly, the damping of the gear selector feels expensively done, and it's a leather shifter. The glove box is damped. Most cars this price, it would just fall open with a nasty clang. The weighting of the central box lid feels expensive and nicely done. So it's a bit of a mishmash of the obviously cheap and forgivable with a few odds and ends that feel like they're from a car from the class above. But the big problem in the interior of the MG5 for me is the driving position. Now, driving positions are very subjective, so you've got to take yourself down to the dealership and sit in this car and see if it works for you. For me, the seat is too high. It doesn't have any under thigh angle adjustment. There's no lumbar adjustment for the backrest, but criminally in 2023, there's no reach adjustment for the steering wheel. So your hands always feel like they're at a slightly imperfect angle compared to where you need the seat at for the pedals. Again, this is something you have to try out because it might be perfectly fine for you. All the comments that I just gave you about the driving position mean that the MG5 ends up being a very weird car where the back seat is actually more comfortable than the front seat. And that's because this space has actually been designed really well. There is a lot of thigh angle on the base of the rear seat, so your legs are fully supported. You don't really have to splay them on a long drive. The backrest is comfy, so you could do a few hours back here easy, especially because it's big. The MG5 has really generous proportions, even compared to its sedan rivals. So legroom's good, toe room's good, headroom, I've got another inch or two above my 6-foot frame. You even get an air vent, one air vent back here. It's like an omni vent, and also a USB port. But again, we come back to some of the mishmash between some stuff being really well finished like that and other things being a little bit odd. So there's no center armrest, for instance, which would make it even nicer back here. That said, not every single one of these cars' rivals has that feature. And naturally, we have hard touch doors, but soft armrests on them, something that we don't see all the time at this price point. So all in all, this car's got a great back seat. Its size really does favors for it. Moving around the back of the MG5 now, I might give you a word on styling. I don't think this vehicle is the best looking sedan in the world. It's a little bit too catfishy for me at the front, but taken as a whole and maybe in a more reserved color, it's not so bad, and the low slung profile is probably more desirable than an SUV from my perspective. But in royal yellow, you're certainly going to be seen. And interestingly, there's not too much to show that you went for the cheapest version. There's still a little bit of chrome trim running down the side, 16-inch alloy wheels, and no badges here on the back that say Vibe or base model, just MG5, so it's actually finished quite well. Now, it is a sedan, which some people will like, but I really think it should have been a hatchback. It looks like a big hatchback, and that would have made it more practical. As it is a sedan, the loading aperture is quite narrow, and the amount of space on offer at 405 litres is a lot less than the best in the class. But under the floor, with a handy pull tab, there is a space saver spare. Kind of looks like there's enough room for a full size, but it's not in there. But this is one area where you'll notice some pretty strong cost cutting, and that's that there's just no grab handle here to close the boot without getting your fingers dirty. Now, we just washed this car, which is why it looks so clean. But for most people, you don't wash the car all the time, and you're going to accumulate a whole bunch of dirt here on the boot from the road, which is going to go straight onto your fingers. It's a small thing, but MG hasn't added it. When it comes to running costs, the MG5 sedan is nothing outstanding, apart from the warranty. At 7 years, unlimited kilometers, it's equal to the Kia Cerato in this segment, which is really good. But servicing, you've got to do it every 10,000 Ks, bit inconvenient. The first 5 years will cost just under $2,000 in scheduled servicing. But when it comes to petrol, things aren't so bad. Well, you can't open the petrol cap from outside the car. That's a bit old school. But the amount of fuel used by this vehicle's efficient and very modest engine is pretty decent. I got 5.9 litres per 100 Ks on the highway and 8 litres per 100 Ks in town. Given the size of the car, I think that's acceptable. So then, what is the MG5 like to drive? Well, I think the best way to describe the driving dynamics of this sedan would be pretty rough around the edges. All in all, the fundamental experience isn't too bad, and I think it's possible that the MG4's talented chassis engineers at least had something like a conference call with the chassis engineers for the MG5, because occasionally here in the MG5 sedan you do get glimpses of MG's emerging capability to engineer a vehicle which is fun to drive, and there are actually elements to the handling of the MG5 that I really like, and I'll come back to those in just a minute. But first of all, I want to start, as I always do, with the powertrain, because this is one area where you can spend a little bit of extra cash and get yourself an MG5 which is a bit more capable. Now, I've chosen to review the $24,990 driveaway special because that is such a stunning price in the year 2023, and as I've said repeatedly, MG really deserves congratulation for that price. But it does mean that you're taking quite a hit under the bonnet, because we're running here with a non-turbocharged petrol 4-cylinder engine and a CVT automatic transmission. Now, as non-turbo petrol engines and CVT combos go, this one actually isn't that bad in terms of refinement. MG has done a really good job at dulling down the thrashing noise of the engine, and it does need to thrash, it does need to rev, because it doesn't have all that much low down torque. But compared to some rivals, even vehicles like a non-hybrid Camry, which is no longer for sale in Australia, but you used to be able to get one, the MG5 isn't too loud, it isn't too coarse, which I think is an achievement in itself. But what it also definitely isn't is quick in any way. It's not a fast experience. We have, of course, independently tested the performance. I'll put that up on the screen now, but I think, it's fair to say progress is quite lethargic in the MG5. As we expected, the MG5 really wasn't a quick car in our 0 to 100 test. Its time was over 11 seconds, though in town you won't really notice this thanks to the quick thinking CVT. Of course, the turbo version
will be faster. More concerning for us was the braking. The MG5's best stop from 100 to 0 was over 40 meters, which is really long for the small or medium car segment. But within 3 stops, the braking distance had blown out to over 44 meters, which is like a dual cab ute and nowhere near good enough.
And pulling up hills, you are going to hear that engine revving and you are going to need to plan your overtaking on a country road. Now the problem is compounded by something that MG could easily fix through software, and that is the calibration for the throttle pedal. This is not an easy vehicle to keep at a certain speed while you're going up hills. This shouldn't be a problem with a CVT. With infinite ratios, so to speak, we should be able to hold a level throttle pedal, and the MG5 should be able to maintain, say, 100 kilometers per hour going uphill on the highway. But instead, you're having to dig further and further into the pedal, then you over rev and the vehicle speeds up too much and it makes too much noise, etc. The reason I say it can be fixed through software is that when you have cruise control switched on the MG5, it actually maintains speed pretty well. Better than some cars with adaptive cruise control. It doesn't create a ruckus and it has very fine CVT control, but only when you're in cruise control. That should also be the case when you're just driving manually, so hopefully MG can fix that. Now, if you do spend up on the higher grade version of the MG5, you do change out to a turbocharged engine. Now, I certainly don't think it's going to be the end of the world in terms of high performance, but it is just going to give you a little bit more low-end torque, which is going to mean you don't have to rev that engine so much. That being said, with the fuel economy of the non-turbo being pretty acceptable, I don't think that many people are really going to need to spend up on that turbo engine unless you do want the extra features of the higher model. Now, when I say the MG5 is a bit rough around the edges, I don't just mean it's pretty slow, which it is. You hear more going on in this vehicle than you would in virtually any other rival. Kia Cerato, Mazda 3, Toyota Corolla sedan, Hyundai i30 sedan. It's just a little bit unpolished and unfinished. Every time you tap the brake pedal, you hear some strange brake actuation noise in the MG5. Can't hear it right now because there's a bit of road noise on this country road, but around town you just hear this clicking every time you touch the brake. If you add too much steering lock too quickly, you hear the actuation noise of the stability control program getting to work, even though ESC hasn't actually done anything. It hasn't actually needed to intervene. It's just setting itself up, and you can hear this clicking mechanical noise as it sort of reacts to a problem that hasn't happened yet. There's some whirring mechanical sounds from the CVT that would be dulled out in an equivalent Toyota. So these are some of the areas where MG is saving money, avoiding removing these mechanical noises, but on the flip side, they're delivering a car at a far sharper price than any of those rivals that I've just mentioned. So as long as you go into the driving experience expecting the MG5 to not have the level of luxury, the level of polish, the level of refinement of a Toyota, a Mazda, Hyundai, Kia, then you're going to be about on the money. And one surprise for me was actually that the MG5 has a pretty reasonable chassis on it. Now, once you have picked up some speed on a country road, albeit slowly because of the engine and CVT, you'll find that the MG5 can actually maintain quite a good pace in the corners, and it is far better in the corners than an MG ZS or an MG HS. I think there's 2 reasons for that. Firstly, it's a sedan. It's lower to the ground, the mass is closer to the ground, so the suspension and the stability control are having to do a lot less to keep the MG5 feeling flat and stable. But secondly, I do think MG is learning, and quite quickly. The ZS and the HS are pretty woeful on a back road. Sorry if you disagree, but that's my opinion. The MG4, by comparison, is a really good product, very convincing. It's an EV hatchback at the right price, but it has nothing to do with this car. It has a different platform, it has different hardware, of course it's fully electric. Even though it's called MG4 and this one's called MG5, it doesn't mean the cars are really similar in any way. But I do think some of the chassis tuning priorities that we observed in the MG4 have come through in some way at least in the MG5. The steering doesn't have much road feel, but the level of weight in it is mature, and it's actually quite easy to place the front end of the MG5. I was quite surprised, but it's actually not a bad vehicle for tackling the corners. It's relatively predictable, it's relatively easy to drive on a back road, and it's maneuverable and fine in town as well. The suspension is acceptable up until a point. It does get flummoxed by constant bumps, the kind of which you do get on B roads here in Australia. and you do get the occasional bang up through the cabin from a nastier bump that something like a Toyota Corolla sedan or Camry would have dialed out successfully. In the MG5, you are getting some repercussions. There's a bit of pogoing from the suspension as well, so the damping isn't quite there, isn't quite up there with a Hyundai or a Kia or a Toyota, but you know what? It's much better than MG was doing a few years ago. So hopefully the vibe, which I'm communicating successfully, is that the MG5 isn't as good as a Mazda 3 sedan, a Hyundai i30 sedan, a Kia Cerato sedan, or the Toyotas, really anywhere. But it's not worlds apart from those vehicles like an older MG would be, and of course it's a lot cheaper than most of them. If you are looking for a vehicle which is not going to push that budget, which is going to deliver you a reasonable experience at a very sharp price point, and you want the sedan form factor, either because it drives better or you just don't want an SUV, the MG5 is an interesting proposition. Just don't confuse it for something like the MG4, which is considerably more talented again. So that's my verdict on the 2024 MG5 Vibe. I don't think we can say that this car is a disappointment. In fact, in some ways, I think it's a bit of a pleasant surprise. Certainly, it's nowhere near as good as the MG4, which is the best model that MG has ever made by a big margin. But I do think this is better than any of MG's SUV models, and also the MG3 hatchback, for instance. I think this brand is learning and learning quite quickly. The engine, it's slow, but it gets the job done. The ride quality is acceptable, and the handling is actually pretty good. But you'd be wrong to think the MG5 isn't without compromise, because it certainly has them. The driving position was pretty terrible for me. There are far too many weird mechanical noises going on, and refinement certainly isn't the best. And you also miss out on adaptive cruise, lane keeping assist, and a bunch of other modern safety aids on this base model. But, and it's a big but, this car's $24,990 drive away. That is so affordable in the year 2023 to be buying a brand new car with a very long warranty. So if you're shopping at that budget end of the market, instead of spending up big on one of this car's rivals, I say throw the MG5 into the mix, at least take it for a test drive and see what you reckon. I think that's what I would do. So let me know what you think down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell if you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to share it with anyone that might find it useful. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.